Hi everyone, this is chapter 6, the endocrine system. So we're going to be talking a lot about hormones in the system and how they're regulated in the body. So the first thing here is just our cartoon of the pancreas, and the pancreas happens to make several hormones, and this one is just talking about the beta cells that make insulin. And if your beta cells are not producing insulin, then you have diabetes. Diabetes mellitus to be type 1 to be exact. All right, so let's move on. Just remember that your endocrine organs, all your endocrine glands are made of epithelial tissue, and with the exception of maybe the posterior pituitary, which is neural. But if you look at your picture here, you can see that the endocrine organs are divided into two categories: the primary endocrine organs and the secondary endocrine organs. And what that means is that's the primary job of this organ is to produce hormone. So we can see that we have the pineal gland in the brain, the hypothalamus in the brain, the pituitary gland is also hanging down from the brain, the thyroid gland, parathyroids, which are embedded on the posterior side of the thyroid gland, our thymus, the adrenal gland, the pancreas. And that might be surprising to some of you because the pancreas does also have a digestive system function, but it is considered a primary endocrine organ. Then we can see our gonads, the ovaries for female and the testes for male are considered primary organs. And the placenta, which is not shown here, we have a male here, but only found in the pregnant woman, which secretes its own hormones. Secondary endocrine organs are going to be organs that have a primary function that sort of trumps their endocrine function, but they do also produce hormones. So the heart, the stomach, the liver, the kidney, the small intestine, and the skin. So let's get started by looking at the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. So just to remind you where the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland are located. So the hypothalamus, remember, is this inferior portion of the diencephalon of the brain, this area where I'm coloring in now. And then it's connected to the pituitary gland by a stalk, and this stalk is called the infundibulum. The pituitary gland has two portions to it. It has a posterior lobe and an anterior lobe. And we're going to start with the posterior lobe. The posterior lobe is going to be neural tissue. So if you look at this picture here, the neurons in the hypothalamus, right? These neurons are going to be the neurosecretory cells, and they're in the paraventricular nucleus, as well as in the supraoptic nucleus of the hypothalamus. And each of these areas are going to secrete separate hormones. So you can see the supraoptic nucleus is going to secrete oxytocin. The paraventricular nucleus is going to secrete antidiuretic hormone. So remember, the word nucleus in the nervous system does not mean where DNA is held. That the word nucleus in the nervous system means it's a collection of neurons that have sort of the same function. So we can see the soma of these neurons, and we can see the long axon leaving the hypothalamus, traveling through the infundibulum and into the posterior pituitary. And in the synaptic terminals, we're going to have the the hormones stored, and then the hormones are going to be released into the bloodstream here, into the capillary network of the posterior pituitary, so that they can go and travel around the body in your bloodstream. So remember also that the word endocrine gland means that is a ductless gland. So the hormones are produced inside cells, and then they're going to be secreted and go directly into the bloodstream. There's no cavity or duct that they're traveling into first. So the pituitary is going to regulate energy and water balances. It's going to regulate growth, responding to stress and reproduction. And the pituitary secretes 8 hormones, which is going to either act directly on some non-endocrine tissues, such as growth hormone, which will act on bones for growth, or muscles for growth. So that's going to act directly on tissues of your body. Or more commonly, actually, the pituitary gland is going to act to modulate other endocrine glands. So they're going to either stimulate or inhibit other endocrine glands to either secrete their hormones or to not secrete their hormones, right? And so these modulating hormones that the pituitary gland sends out are called trophic hormones. Regardless, the pituitary gland, both posterior and anterior side, are going to be controlled by the hypothalamus. So ultimately, it's the hypothalamus that controls the secretions from the pituitary gland. And the hypothalamus, of course, is an area of your brain. So it's getting signal inputs from your body, all those afferent signals coming into the brain. And so the hypothalamus is an area that helps to control homeostasis of the body by these hormones. So we're going to take a look at the neurohypophysis first, or the posterior lobe. So let's just stay on this picture. So the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland, again, it's neural tissue. So we can see the axons, the soma in the hypothalamus, the axons coming into the posterior lobe. So the posterior lobe secretes two hormones. This is antidiuretic hormone, also known as ADH, its abbreviations, or vasopressin. And this is going to be secreted in times where your solute concentration of your blood is very high, which means that you're dehydrated because you're not, right, if you're losing water from your body, then the salt content or the ion content, the solute content of your blood is going to go up because you're losing water. It's going to become like hypertonic, for example. So you're going to have, that is going to be stimulating antidiuretic hormones. So antidiuretic is going to retain water. Okay. So just think about drugs that are diuretics will help you lose water. They help you actually have copious amounts of urine so that you can basically flush extra water out of the body. So antidiuretic is to help your body retain water. And this is a really, really important hormone. If you didn't make adequate amounts of this hormone, then you could actually, you would be thirsty all the time, and you would have to drink lots and lots of water because you wouldn't actually be able to retain that water. It would just go right through your body and you would urinate out the water. So what the ADH works on is the kidney. So this antidiuretic hormone is going to have its effects on the kidney, and the kidney is going to increase water reabsorption. So instead of letting it go into the urine, it's going to pull it back and put it into your bloodstream. The second hormone that your posterior pituitary secretes is oxytocin. And oxytocin is a really interesting hormone because when they first found it, they thought it was going to be a hormone that allowed childbirth to occur by the pressure. And we talked about this with the positive feedback loop at the beginning of the semester, where the pressure on the cervix is going to feed back to the hypothalamus to secrete oxytocin. More oxytocin is going to create more contraction of the smooth muscle of the uterus until, of course, there's childbirth, which is the end of that feedback loop. So that is one job of oxytocin. So it's to help in childbirth by targeting the smooth muscles of the uterus, but you also find it regarding women to eject milk. So there's two hormones regarding milk production and ejection. So prolactin is a hormone that's to synthesize the milk itself, and then oxytocin helps to squeeze the smooth muscle around those glands and eject the milk. So again, a target for smooth muscle. But we find it also in men. It helps the prostate gland. There's smooth muscle in the gland itself to secrete the semen contents. And then there's also the newfound sort of, quote unquote new research. It's been known for quite a while, but that oxytocin helps bonding, and it's actually secreted in large amounts after orgasm. And so it actually creates bonding between people. And it's also secreted after childbirth, so a woman bonds with her baby. And there is a pathology, so if you don't actually have enough oxytocin for women who've had a child, they really have they don't want to take care of the baby. So that's a pathology. That's not, that's a low oxytocin amount in the brain, but it's actually, it could happen. All right, so that's the posterior pituitary gland. And now we're going to look at the anterior pituitary gland, or also known as the adenohypophysis. So the posterior pituitary is nervous tissue, All right, and the anterior pituitary is going to be endocrine cells. These are going to be epithelial tissue. Okay, so it's two different tissue types. So this is more of a true endocrine gland because it is made of your epithelial cells. And just a second on the portal system here. So the anterior pituitary is interesting because it has this portal system. And what the portal system is, you have two capillary beds. So you have your first capillary bed up near in the hypothalamus. It's actually called the median eminence of the hypothalamus. And the second capillary bed is within the anterior pituitary itself. So the process that happens is the neurosecretory cells of the hypothalamus are going to create these releasing hormones. So these hormones here, I'll call it releasing hormones. And they are going to be sort of given to the bloodstream in this first capillary bed. The capillary bed is then going to be connected by a portal vein running through your infundibulum to the second capillary bed. And so these releasing hormones are going to travel and then be secreted and have their target cells on the anterior pituitary endocrine cells. Then these cells, these endocrine cells, will then release their hormones right into the bloodstream and then to the body. So the portal system is unique because for your body, when you talk about capillaries, right, we usually talk about these arteries, right? Arteries will branch and branch and branch, and then they'll become these capillary beds where you'll have highly branched areas. And remember that capillaries are the thinnest, most, I'm going to mess up drawing a capillary bed here, but they're the thinnest blood vessels you have. That's where diffusion takes place. It's across the capillaries. And then these will eventually converge onto a vein, right, and bring the blood back to the heart. So there's usually just one capillary bed that's tied between an artery and a vein. They don't usually come in succession where you have one capillary bed that's connected to a second capillary bed by a vein. This is unusual for the body. So this is called the portal system. So this is how your anterior pituitary works. It gets its commands from the hypothalamus. The hormones that are released by the hypothalamus are called releasing hormones. They're going to travel through the portal system, have their effect on the endocrine glands of the anterior pituitary. They will either stimulate or inhibit certain hormones to be released. If the anterior pituitary is releasing hormones, then the hormones will travel in the bloodstream to the rest of the body. So there's lots of hormones that are secreted by the anterior pituitary gland. So let's talk about those. And just a quick note in your notes here that a lot of hormones are released on a pulsating or episodic basis. So they're not released at a constant level all day. They rise and fall throughout a day. So there's a circadian rhythm to their release. And this, just for an example, this is growth hormone, where you can see that growth hormone is actually secreted in high amounts in early sleep. And then it starts to go down right before you wake up. Okay, and then it sort of pulses through the day. But it is going to increase in response to stress and also to sleep. And it decreases in response to increased blood glucose levels. So just an idea or just a visualization of how hormones have their own rhythm. And so you don't sort of overwhelm the anterior pituitary to keep secreting these hormones all the time. All right. So I have in the notes that there's a drop in the growth hormone just before waking because cortisol is on its rise. So then you'd see cortisol levels low and then cortisol levels start to rise right before you wake up, because cortisol is going to help your blood glucose increase, right? It's ready to start the day. You should have some blood sugar in your body so that you can start to, make your cup of coffee, right? You need that initial sugar to navigate the morning right before you get your breakfast. All right, so let's talk about these trophic hormones. Okay, so there's lots of them. You should know these, have these memorized and their effects downstream. And what we're looking at is something called an axis. So the word axis is used to describe the hormones that are going to impact each other. So the first hormone being from the hypothalamus. So in your notes, I have the axis is the hypothalamic hormone. And so the releasing hormone. So the word trophic means that hormone has an effect on another hormone producing gland. So they're called releasing hormones. So the first one in the axis is from the hypothalamus. Okay, here's your hypothalamus. The second one in the axis is what's released from the anterior pituitary. Remember, the hypothalamus is going to release hormones that control hormones in the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary hormones are going to travel through the bloodstream to the rest of the body, and they're going to act on a third endocrine gland. Okay, so that's here. So let's look at some of these. So there is going to be, let's start with prolactin releasing hormone. All right, so we have prolactin releasing hormone here, and that's going to act on the anterior pituitary to release prolactin. So the prolactin is released from the anterior pituitary. Prolactin is going to act on the breast tissue to make milk, right? And this is a great hormone because it's prolactation, right? It stimulates the breast to make milk. So this is going to happen in a woman right after she gives birth. And then there's going to be prolactin inhibiting hormone, all right? So there's a hormone that inhibits the prolactin. So you can see the positive signs are used for stimulation and the negative signs are used for inhibition. And that's going to inhibit the prolactin. So we're going to stop producing breast milk. So maybe when the baby has weaned off the breast, then you would start seeing a rise in prolactin inhibiting hormone. Then there is the thyrotropin releasing hormone here, right? And that's going to stimulate the release of thyroid stimulating hormone. The thyroid stimulating hormone is going to act on the thyroid gland, so travel in the blood, reach the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland will then release its thyroid hormones. And the thyroid hormones here are T3 and T4. Okay, so the T3 and T4, the 3 and the 4 are going to stand for iodine atoms that are necessary to create the hormone. So 3 and 4 are iodine. Okay, so they have very long names. The names are tetraiodothyronine and triiodothyronine, right? So it's T3, T4. And they are going to increase metabolism. Okay, so T3 and T4 are going to increase metabolism. So when you hear the word thyroid hormones, it's going to refer to T3 and T4. It's going to refer to your metabolism. There is another hormone that your thyroid gland makes called calcitonin, which does not influence metabolism, just putting it out there. Then we have the corticotropin releasing hormone here. It's going to stimulate adrenocorticotropic hormone. And this is going to stimulate your adrenal cortex. And this, you need to know that it's cortex because the cortex and the medulla are different. They're going to secrete different hormones. So the adrenal cortex is going to secrete, in this image, you have cortisol. So cortisol is also known as glucocorticoids. And this is a hormone that's produced in times of stress. Okay, so not like immediate stress as in like you're getting into a car accident, you got into a car accident, but long-term stress that would last for like a couple days. You have a test coming up, you're stressed, that would be a time where you release cortisol. All right, then we look at your growth hormone releasing hormone right here, which is going to impact your anterior pituitary to create growth hormone. Growth hormone travels throughout the body, and there's two targets here. So growth hormone works on the liver and also on many, many cells in your body. So almost all your cells in your body can respond to growth hormone. And it's to grow, right? So growth hormone is used in growing bigger. So when you're a child, you have a lot of growth hormone, and as an adult, you have less and less growth hormone. So many of the cells can respond to growth hormone. The liver is going to secrete an insulin-like growth factor. So insulin-like growth factor is released in response to growth hormone. And so that is going to also have an impact on growth of different tissues. So it's also kind of a growth factor. All right, next we have a somatostatin. So I call it somatostatin or growth hormone inhibitory hormone. Sorry. Yeah, that's it, growth hormone inhibitory hormone. And it's going to inhibit the production of growth hormone. Okay. Then we have our gonadotropin releasing hormone here. And gonadotropin, so gonads, right, are the ovaries and testes. There's the organs that make your gametes. And this hormone is going to stimulate the production of two different kinds of hormones. LH stands for luteinizing hormone. FSH stands for follicle stimulating hormone. Both of these hormones work on the gonads. Okay, so when the gonads receive the stimulation from LH or FSH, then the gonads will then produce their hormones, androgens for males. Okay, so androgens are going to be testosterone is the most prevalent androgen that you have, and it's also the hormone that everybody's heard of. But then there's also a lesser known, and I think I forgot it right now, it's androstenone or something like that. And then your female hormones are going to be your estrogens and progesterone. Okay, and of course they're going to have their effects on the cycle of either producing sperm or maturing the egg for reproduction. All right, so those are the hormones from the anterior pituitary. And a question here before we move on, which of the hormones below is secreted by the posterior pituitary and what is its function? All right, so the one that is secreted by the posterior pituitary that we just talked about is oxytocin, stimulates uterine contraction. All right, so a quick word on feedback loops. The way that your hormones are kept in check is a feedback mechanism, right? So these negative feedback loops can be long or they can be short. And what this means is basically the short loop, you can see that we have here, right? It is the direct hormone that can feed back to the hormone that stimulated it. So if we're taking a look at this flow chart, we have our hypothalamus here with our trophic hormone 1, which is our releasing hormones, right? And our releasing hormones will travel to the anterior pituitary by that portal vein. Then we have this trophic hormone 2, right? So as you increase the amount of trophic hormone 2, it'll feed back to the hypothalamus to regulate it, to downregulate it. So that's the short loop. So it's just one step away. Longer loops are when you have a couple steps away, right? Or at least one or two steps away. So the endocrine gland itself, so hormone 3 here, right, is going to feed back all the way to the brain and then inhibit the releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. Okay, so the result, right, we can mediate how much hormone is that the target cell is being exposed to. This is just a specific example, right? So this is our general flow chart. This is a specific example of a long negative feedback loop. So this is where we have our corticotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus going to the anterior pituitary to secrete adrenocorticotropic hormone, right? So this is very descriptive. It's going to go to the adrenal gland. It's going to go to the cortex of the adrenal gland. So then the adrenal gland is going to secrete cortisol, and that is your stress hormone. And the amount of cortisol in the bloodstream can feed back, and can feed back in two areas actually. So it can feed, and this is possible as well, right? You can have two areas being negatively fed back. I don't know what the past tense of that is, but so the adrenal gland is going to feed to the anterior pituitary to minimize its hormone, ACTH, or it can feed back all the way to the hypothalamus and minimize the releasing hormone there. Okay, but either way, we have this cortisol feeding back to the axis, right, so that we can control the cortisol levels. All right, so that is a feedback. Now we're going to move on and just talk about the other primary endocrine glands. The pineal gland is going to be located in the brain, in the diencephalon region again. And this is going to secrete a hormone called melatonin. So please don't get this confused with melanin. A lot of people do that. So I tell my students, melatonin puts you to bed. So there is a 2 in there, whereas melanin does not, right? Melanin is the pigment in your skin. So melatonin is a hormone that's thought to control your circadian rhythm. And people are still looking into what other functions this hormone may have, but it is known to be involved in the circadian rhythm. So that's basically the more melatonin you have secreted, it's going to make you feel sleepy. Okay, the more sleepy you're going to feel. And this is stimulated by darkness. Okay, so to increase your melatonin levels, it's a lack of light or darkness. And then opposite that, right? If it's light outside, it's going to decrease the melatonin levels, and that's going to decrease your sleepiness, okay, or increase your wakefulness. So that means that this endocrine gland here actually gets information coming from the eyes, from the retina. It gets retinal information so that it knows if it's daytime or nighttime. All right, so let's see. Oh, and then the place that the portion, the hypothalamus that controls the secretion of melatonin is called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. So that's a term that it's a pretty well-known nucleus of the hypothalamus. So suprachiasmatic. Okay, let's look at the next gland here. This is the thyroid gland. So your thyroid gland makes T3 and T4, and this is going to increase metabolism. So the more T3 and T4 you create, the more your metabolism kind of speeds up. Now, your metabolism throughout the day changes a little bit, but you have to know that you can have too much or too little thyroid hormone, and that's called hyperthyroidism or hypothyroidism. Hyperthyroid, right? So if you're hyperthyroid, if you have hyperthyroid, that means you're secreting a lot of T3 and T4, too much T3 and T4. And that means that your body is kind of kicked up into a high gear, or I like to think of it as like putting your your foot down on the gas pedal in the car, but you're just revving the engine. So if you are secreting too much T3 and T4, you tend to lose weight and feel very hot and warm and maybe have trouble sleeping. And also your heart is racing. And also things like you have dry skin, your eyes have extra pressure in there. It's pushing the eyeballs out, so things like that. And then hypothyroid is the lower, pathologically low levels of T3 and T4. And the opposite would be true. So you would feel very tired. You would tend to gain weight. You would feel cold. You'd be lethargic, have trouble concentrating. So different, so these are the two extremes, and this is a way to illustrate what T3 and T4 does for you, right? So it regulates your metabolic rate. All right, let's look at calcitonin. So calcitonin, I don't have a picture of a histology slide, but there are other cells in the thyroid gland that make calcitonin. Calcitonin is a hormone that decreases the calcium concentration in the bloodstream. So where is calcium stored in your body? Calcium is stored mainly in your bones, right? Mainly in the bones. And so calcitonin actually activates the osteoblasts to store and start to build, mineralize the bone, right? Put the calcium into the bone. So it stimulates, and you have to take that away from blood. So it's going to lower the blood levels of calcium, right? Because it's going to put that calcium into the bone. All right, so let's look at the next gland, which is the parathyroid glands. So this is actually behind the thyroid gland. There are 4 parathyroid glands, as you can see here, and they're embedded in the thyroid. They're completely different glands, but that's where they live. They live embedded on the posterior side of your thyroid. And these glands make a hormone called parathyroid hormone, and they're going to act against calcitonin. They're going to increase calcium levels in the bloodstream. So increase calcium levels in the blood, right? So when hormones do the opposite thing, that those are called antagonistic hormones, and when you have 2 hormones that work against each other, right, they help maintain a constant level or homeostasis of a certain amount of calcium ions in the bloodstream. So we know how important calcium is when we talked about the nervous system and how calcium ions are used to promote exocytosis of neurotransmitters. We also will get to the muscular system, where calcium is really important for muscle contraction. So there must be a constant level of calcium in the bloodstream in order for your body to function correctly. All right, so the way that the way that calcium parathyroid hormone is that it activates their osteoclasts, right? So remember, these are the bone cells that are going to mine the bone and dissolve the bone and release the calcium stores into the bone so that it can be liberated into the bloodstream. All right, so what is the primary function of thyroid hormones? All right, you should see B. So remember, I said thyroid hormones is metabolic rate. Even though the thyroid makes calcitonin, when you hear the term thyroid hormones, it's referring to T3 and T4. All right, our next gland is the thymus. It creates thymosin, and this is going to regulate T cell maturation and function. So the thymus, remember, is the leader line is actually not here. The thymus in this picture is green, and this is the only organ in your body that tends to shrink over time. Well, not the only one, but it shrinks dramatically, almost to the point where there's no thymus left when you are over the age of 50. All right, next we have our adrenal glands. So the adrenal glands have 2 major regions, the adrenal cortex, which releases its hormones, and then the adrenal medulla, which releases a couple of different hormones. The adrenal cortex has 3 different layers to it that I'm not going to have you guys memorize, but just know that each of these layers will have its own hormone being produced. Remember that the adrenal gland, it sits on the superior pole of the kidney, right? So it sits on each kidney. You have 2 adrenal glands. And so let me just speak real quick about the adrenal cortex. So the cortex, which is the outer part, let's actually look at this, right? So the cortex is this outer portion, and this is the region that's going to make your glucocorticoids, mineralocorticoids, and also some sex hormones. So it's easy to remember mineralocorticoids and glucocorticoids because the cortex word is in the name, right? And the primary mineralocorticoid is called aldosterone, and aldosterone is going to help to reabsorb sodium and secrete potassium. All right, so aldosterone is going to impact the kidneys, and the kidneys are going to they're going to mediate sodium and potassium levels. Okay, glucocorticoids, we already talked about glucocorticoids. The most prominent one is called cortisol, and that's going to mediate long-term stress. And when you're stressed, your body wants to have sugar available whether or not you ate. So it's going to take the sugar stores that are in your body, the glycogen, and start breaking it down. So it's going to promote glycogenolysis, and it's also going to promote gluconeogenesis, which is basically just making sugar from scratch, right? Making glucose from scratch. So it's also going to regulate protein, carbohydrate, and lipid metabolism, and it's basically just a kind of hormone that sets your body up so that you can respond to stress, that you have the energy responding to stress. Long term, however, is very unhealthy for you to have high, elevated levels of cortisol in your bloodstream. Over a long period of time, it tends to be immunosuppressive. So your immune system will get suppressed, and people tend to get sick easier. So long-term cortisol is actually unhealthy, and it's immunosuppressive. Right. Yes. Okay. So that is what I have, and then the in the notes I have that there's actually a therapeutic form of this. So when you get a cortisone shot, there's hydrocortisone over the counter, right? Those are to decrease swelling. So swelling is a function of your immune system. It can be, but your immune system causes swelling sometimes in allergy. Your immune system causes swelling if you're injured. The white blood cells will create cytokines. The cytokines are going to promote vasodilation. The vasodilation causes swelling. So this hydrocortisone and cortisone will actually dampen the response of your white blood cells. So it dampens the amount of swelling they can do, so then the swelling goes down. And it's really common for people if you have like chronic swelling or inflammation in joints, for example, that you can get cortisone shots. All right, so let's look at the adrenal medulla, which is unique because it is going to be innervated by your autonomic nervous system. So you can see in this picture that we actually have a neuron, right? So this is called a splanchnic nerve. You don't need to memorize that, but it's a neuron that comes and directly synapses with these special cells called chromaffin cells in the adrenal medulla. And the adrenal medulla, the chromaffin cells are going to make quote unquote adrenaline. When you say adrenaline, you're really referring to epinephrine. So epinephrine, 80% of your adrenaline is epinephrine, 20% is a cousin called norepinephrine, and both of those are going to elicit the fight or flight response. Okay, so this is your sympathetic nervous system that these guys are going to mediate. So the hormones epinephrine and norepinephrine will go into the bloodstream and set your body up to fight or flight. And again, this is going to use glucose metabolism. So you're going to start to see glycogenolysis again. You're going to have a lot of glucose put into the bloodstream because again, you want to feed your cells sugar so that they all are ready to make ATP so that you can be ready to handle an immediate stress. And we know that the epinephrine and norepinephrine, these are short-term stress. Short-term stress. So this is when you do have an accident, like a car accident, or maybe there's a menacing animal running at you if you're camping and a bear is coming at you. I mean, that's terrible, but those are the times where you have a lot of adrenaline running through your body. And of course, people have been known to report extra strength and being able to run faster when you have that adrenaline in your body. All right, so just a reminder that the epinephrine and norepinephrine are catecholamines. These are a group of neurotransmitters, and it's by neural stimulation. So this is one exception where we talked about a lot of these trophic hormones, one hormone controlling another hormone, but this is actually the nervous system. All right, so let's look at the pancreas. Oh, a question for you. Which gland releases glucocorticoids such as cortisol in response to increased adrenocorticotropic hormone from the anterior pituitary? So hopefully you know this is the adrenal cortex. All right, so here's our pancreas. If you forgot where it is in the body, it is nestled posterior to the stomach. It is the head of the pancreas is going to hug the C shape of your duodenum. And it has both endocrine function and exocrine function. So exocrine function, it's going to be a lot of digestive enzymes, right? And those are from acinar cells that populate the pancreas. And then the endocrine function of your pancreas is going to come from a population of specialized cells formed in little islands, and those are called islets, right? So pancreatic islets or islets of Langerhans. And so this is your islet of Langerhans. So the islets are are complex, they're heterogeneous, they have different cell populations in them. We can see, this is kind of a pretty picture where they put your acinar cells surrounding an islet. But inside your islet, which is this blue-green area, we have alpha cells. They're going to secrete glucagon. We have beta cells that secrete insulin, and we have delta cells that secrete somatostatin, and we have F cells that secrete pancreatic polypeptide. So starting with beta cells. Beta cells, if you look at just the overall islet of Langerhans, you can see that the majority of your cells are beta cells. Your beta cells are going to create insulin, and this is the hormone that is, the controlling the blood sugar levels. It's going to pull blood from the bloodstream, right? So do I have a picture of this? No. Oh, here's a nice histology slide, a nice reminder of anatomy, right? Here's your islet of Langerhans, right? And then the surrounding that is a lot of acinar, the exocrine parts of your pancreas. So with insulin, insulin is going to mediate blood sugar. As when you eat, your blood sugar, the glucose in the blood goes up, right? You have more sugar. And then you will increase your insulin so that the insulin will help to decrease the blood sugar content. Okay, so your cells will start to take up the sugar in your blood when insulin is present. We talked about this briefly with the GLUT4 transporter, and we'll talk about that just really quickly again. I thought I had a picture, maybe I don't. Okay. So anyhow, just to, because I have it in the outline, remember that there is a transporter mechanism. So if I drew the cell membrane here, here is the insulin receptor. Okay, receptor. Here is a vesicle, and the vesicle will have these GLUT4 glucose transporters embedded in the vesicle membrane. So when insulin binds to the insulin receptor, okay, there's a signal transduction cascade that's going to allow this to come up to this plasma membrane, and it's going to embed those glucose transporters into the plasma membrane, and that way your glucose molecules via facilitated diffusion can go through those transporters and into the cell, right? So we're taking the sugars from the blood or from the interstitial fluid into the cells, and we're lowering the amount of sugar that's present in the blood. Turning our attention to alpha cells. So alpha cells make an antagonistic hormone called glucagon. So glucagon is going to increase your blood sugar by stimulating glycogenolysis, or gluconeogenesis. So when you're starving between meals, you haven't eaten in a very long time, and your blood sugar drops, then this hormone will be produced and it will raise the blood sugar. Then we have delta cells. So delta cells are going to create somatostatin. This is a great hormone name. Somato means soma means body, and then statin means to stop. And I have this written somewhere in the outline. But somatostatin is going to inhibit growth hormone. So soma statin is to stop or to pause. So to pause the body from growing. And then so the somatostatin can also regulate digestion. It can also regulate absorption of nutrients. Then we have F cells. So F cells are going to secrete your pancreatic polypeptide. These are going to inhibit the exocrine secretions of the pancreas. So these F cells here can actually feed back on the pancreas itself and inhibit the secretions from the acinar cells. All right, so this is another question for you. Tropic or trophic hormones are hormones released from one endocrine gland that regulate secretions of hormones from another endocrine gland. Which of the following hormones is not a tropic hormone? All right, so hopefully you go through these and you get the answer, oxytocin. Which of the following hormones is released in direct response to neural stimulation? We looked at epinephrine, right? That nerve fiber, the sympathetic nerve fiber, ran all the way from the spinal cord to the adrenal medulla. All right, and that's the end of part 1